very happy to be able to introduce this program. The Museum of Ventura County has been hosting a series of dialogues about change in relationship to COVID-19. This specific series is looking at design elements and how our communities are changing in response to COVID. It's my great pleasure to continue this partnership between the Museum of Ventura County and the American Institute of Architects, Ventura County. It's my pleasure to introduce Mary Follenweider. She is a AIA LEED AP, a longtime architect advocate committed to professional activism, and served as the 2017-18 AIA-CA Vice President of Government Relations, promoting a more proactive legislative agenda, and chair of the AIA Colorado Government Affairs Committee. She served as the president of the AIA Santa Clara Valley and has served on the AIA Ventura County Board of Directors. She was a senior architect with the city of San Jose and as building official for Boulder, Colorado, initiating some of the nation's first sustainable building codes. She holds a Master of Architecture from the University of Colorado and a Bachelor of Science from DePaul University. Tonight, Mary is going to be in dialogue with Nicholas Deitch. We're very happy to have Nick joining us. And I'm going to give a cup before we introduce Nick. I'd just like to say that during the course of tonight's program, we urge the audience to both enter your questions into the Q&A and or the chat function. We'll be moderating that throughout the course of the conversation. We'll be answering questions throughout the dialogue, but also at the end in the last 15 minutes, beginning at about 7:15. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mary to introduce Mr. Deitch. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Denise, and welcome everybody. As Denise said, we've had this series. A month ago, we had a panel discussion on the defining sense of place and exploring if that definition has changed over the last year and a half, or have our perceptions changed about how we look at sense of place. And we are continuing that conversation today with Nicholas Deitch. And sort of my overview is to secure a safe and healthy future for urban communities, specifically Ventura County and its cities, may require to make better use of existing resources, prioritize investments in public health and in infrastructure, and to be inclusive about climate adaptations, enabling job growth and economic recovery while providing livable communities that support a more green, resilient, and equitable future for Ventura citizens. So the thought is, we want to see, we don't need to start from scratch, but we do need to look at what we have here and how we move on. I'd like to introduce Nicholas Deitch, who is the principal of R&RM Design Group. Nick has over 35 years of experience in architecture and urban design with a wide variety of public and private projects, including community planning, historic restoration, adaptive reuse, and mixed-use residential infill. Nick is a strong proponent for thoughtful planning, preservation, and revitalization of communities throughout Ventura County in California. He was former president of the nonprofit corporation or foundation Turning Point. Nick is an advocate for care and housing of the homeless, for affordable housing and housing innovation. He served, and I believe is still serving on the faculty of Ventura County Community College, teaching courses in architecture since 1996. This is, I am so proud to have you welcome Nicholas Deitch, and goes by the word Nick, or goes by the name Nick. So we want to start this conversation where it left off a month ago. We're still talking about sense of change, but I think what we want to look at is, Nick, what is change? What does change look like? What does intentional change look like?
Mm. That's a big question. Hi, Mary and Denise.
Hi.
Thanks again for including me in this conversation. And yeah, just very pleased to be here and share ideas. And we do hope to have some interaction with people who are participating and listening in. Yeah, change is one of those things that I think a lot of us have a love-hate relationship with, right? It's we all like to be comfortable and like to have things sort of, stay predictable. Don't change too much. Don't surprise me. Um, and oftentimes we will accept things and walk past them or drive past them or look past them for years and not actually see things because they've become familiar and comfortable. And one of the examples I use is I attended a church in Ventura and got, of course, got drawn into the committee to look at, improving the grounds. And one of the first things that I started to do was look at the place through fresh eyes. And I pointed out that the church originally had been designed to front on the street and be entered from the street, but everybody went to the parking lots in the back and came in through the back door. And in doing that, we all walked past the trash dumpsters. And so the primary arrival sequence of arriving at this church was to pull into the back parking lot, get out of your car, walk across the asphalt past the dumpsters to get into the sanctuary. And people had honestly just stopped seeing it. We just stopped paying attention. And as soon as I pointed it out, it was like, oh my God, everybody was just, just terribly upset by the idea that they've been walking past the dumpsters to get into the sanctuary for 20 years. So
I also think it's kind of like the sense of smell. You first smell something and you go, oh God, I can't stand that smell. And then you adapt to it. You kind of like grow into it or grow out of it or whatever, that kind of thing.
So I want to, I've put together some slides, and as we were talking beforehand, these are not perfectly orchestrated to the conversation that we may have, and we'll maybe move in and out of these a little bit. But what I like to do is talk about the idea of intentional change, because everything is changing, always. We're constantly changing. Our own bodies are changing. It's just a part of being alive and being a part of an organic structure and an organism that is a community, a city. We go through changes, and certainly Ventura has gone through many, many changes over the last, 15 decades. So part of my process is to diagram things out. And I've done that with the idea of change. I drew this when we brought in a consultant to work with our business back in 2006, 2007 to talk about how to evolve our company. And in the process of that conversation, we talked about intentional change and what does that look like. And for me, I need to diagram things, to process them. And I think this diagram actually works pretty well for the moment. And so I want to share it. Oftentimes, change happens because of some kind of event, a crisis of some kind. And how we respond to that crisis can be very positive or can also be very negative. And we've seen this as a nation. Our nation actually probably was born out of crisis and a revolutionary war. But if we just look at the idea of change, and let's consider COVID. COVID is a crisis. We've just went through a very traumatic effect on our community and on our nation and on the world. And so what is that? And there is this need to respond in this crisis. And there is doubt, and there is the want for security, and there is the fear of having to do something different. There is the longing for nostalgia and the way we think things were as we see them through the idealized past. There is what we, what I call the present reality, and that at the moment is uncertainty. But there's also in that present and in our recent history, there is a stagnation, the malaise, the boredom, the discontent, the comfort, the safety, the mistrust of change, greed, confusion, hesitation, big hesitation about change, right? But there's also this imperative. We don't really have a choice. We need to do something different, or we'll be stuck and we'll try desperately to hold on to the past, the recent past.
The old normal.
Yes, the old normal is
Old
a great way to
normal.
say it. Yeah.
We're supposed to be in the new normal
Mm.
right now.
But if we can embrace this moment, if we can embrace what we've been through with the COVID situation, for example, and I'm talking about personally, I'm talking about businesses and community and our commercial, context. If we can consider the curiosity of the possible, the opportunity, look at it through optimism, there's a creative tension about what we want to change. There's enthusiasm that I'm seeing about, wow, we don't have to go back to the way it was. There's also a lot of people who wish it would just go back to the way it was.
Yes, I
And that's
agree.
totally normal.
Yeah.
But this idea of a paradigm shift, and that term certainly gets overused, but something has broken, and not necessarily broken in a bad way. Something has shifted. And so what does that mean? What do we want to happen? And that's the wonderful opportunity we have right now, is that we get to ask the question, what next? And that's about creating a strategy and a creative manifest of visioning what we want, a vision for the near, and coming up with a plan of action. How do we change this? And again, this is personal. This is my company is going through these dialogues. Um, it's about the unproven and the unlimited. It's about being open and aware and bringing wonder to the conversation. It's about anticipating what we could do. So this is pretty exciting from my view. And I think this is a perfect time to be having this conversation. Uh, Mary and Denise, thank you. I think that, there's just all kinds of wonderful possibilities that can come out of this.
So when we look at change, we go back to the conversation we had a month ago about sense of place. And I want to keep coming back to that because I really believe that of all the cities I've been in or lived in, Ventura has this unique sense of place. And we want to talk about a little bit about, well, how has that sense of place changed in the last year and a half? Or how has our perception of it changed? And I like your concept that change needed to happen, but it may have been something that flowed through, where intentional change means maybe we can keep the best of the past, but move forward in a way that benefits everybody more equitably.
Yeah. And so that's a big question, lots of pieces to it. And that's great.
Yes.
Intentional change. So I think everybody can agree that things are changing no matter what, whether we want them to change or we don't want them to change. There's a lot of people who really wish Ventura would just stop growing, stop changing, just stay exactly as it is. And I think most of us know and understand that that's not an option. It's simply not an option. And cities by their nature are either growing or they're shrinking. And if they're shrinking, it's because there's problems and there's reasons why people don't want to be there anymore. And when they're growing, it's usually because things are, something's good. So people want to come. On the other hand, there's also the idea that we're growing because there's just a natural birth rate and we can't tell people to stop having babies and we're just going to keep having babies. But Ventura has been growing at approximately the rate of about 1% per year, which is a fairly low growth rate. But at a city of 100,000 at 1% a year is going to grow by about 10,000 people every decade. So it's not a huge growth rate, but it certainly adds up.
Right.
But to your question about the sense of place, and I know we all hear this, and I'd be willing to bet that anybody from a town similar to Ventura is going to say that they have a unique sense of place. we form these mental maps about our communities and what we like about them and the things that we try to avoid about them. But there is a sense of place. There is a character to the community. The reality is, if you drive around Southern California and visit the older towns in Southern California, you're going to see a whole lot of similar architecture. The buildings of the 1920s that were built in different parts of Los Angeles are very much like the buildings that were built here in Ventura. But we have a unique geography. We're by the ocean. We're sandwiched between the ocean and the hills. We've got all these interesting constraints that we have to work within, and that makes the community unique. But my theory is that our greatest sense of place, and the idea that people often will say, Ventura is a small town, right? I hear people say Ventura is a small town all the time, and I want to keep it a small town. I think what they're really saying, because Ventura is not a small town, it's about 100,000, 115,000 people probably by now. That's not a small town. But we do have the unique, for Southern California, the unique condition in which I believe a substantial amount of people live and work in this city. And so we have a community of people that we encounter on a daily basis, we work with, we see at the stores, and we cross paths constantly. And I think that the idea of being a small town actually, to me, means being recognized and recognizing people around you, and having places where you go and the people who work there know you and recognize you. I've gone to a grocery store for years, and the checker knows me and is always kind of looking for how I'm doing and how my family is doing, and those are the qualities that I think help us to feel like we live in a small town, even though we do not live in a small town. So
Right.
that sense of places, yeah.
I equate Ventura to Boulder, Colorado, which is where I lived for quite a while. And the number of people, the population of the two cities, Ventura and Boulder, are very similar. But I don't think Boulder has ever been equated to a small town. It's been equated to a republic, but not to a small town. And I agree. Somebody said, I'd know when I moved here, that I would know I was part of the neighborhood when I could go to the grocery store and meet somebody I knew. But I did that all the time in Boulder. So it's interesting.
Yeah, and I guess what it really comes down to is it's kind of cool, actually, that Venturans are conscious of the community, conscious of the place they live in, and that it is unique in their hearts and their minds. And so, yes, as we look at how we will change as a community, it's absolutely right and appropriate that we take a breath and say, wait a minute, how are we changing? Why are we changing? What is it we want as we change? Those are awesome, amazing questions.
Right.
And I've been asking those questions here for 30 years and participating in helping answer those questions. And it's been wonderful. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about that question, what does change look like? Because it is all around us and it's constant. And so, a real simple example, what does change look like? So in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, we came up with this amazing device called the telegraph. And it was basically a mechanism by which we could tap on a key, and across an electric current, we could communicate with somebody hundreds or thousands of miles away from us if the current and the electrical line were connected. And through a code of dots and dashes that we're all familiar with, we could talk to each other. This was a real game changer. This meant that the different parts of the country could communicate with each other very quickly, and news could spread very fast, and a broad awareness of community across the nation could evolve. And that's cool. That's amazing. Then some brilliant, genius came up with the idea of turning that into a talking piece, and we could actually hear someone's voice from 1,000 miles away. We take this stuff for granted. We just accept this as perfectly normal. But this is a very recent evolution in humanity's, presence on this planet. I could have never imagined this thing 20 years ago.
Right.
This thing we carry around in our pocket, and it connects us to virtually all the information in the world, to movies and to, Facebook and to each other. And it's, I mean, I don't think any of us could have predicted this, but look at how it has changed us. Look
Yes.
at how it affects how we live and we move around and communicate with each other, for better or for worse.
Right.
I'm not, I think mostly for better. But clearly there's some things about this that have me worried. I'm worried for my grandson, who his whole world right now is around electronics, especially after COVID. So,
Yes, I was
you
going
know,
to say, and
yeah,
if you want to see the impact of COVID,
yeah.
um, I don't think I actually attended too many Zoom meetings before that, but I want
Oh
to say
my
in the
gosh.
last year and a half, I don't feel like I've gone a day without having a Zoom meeting. So,
It's stunning. It's stunning.
but I think the younger generation, even technology, that's what they know and that's what they're comfortable with.
Yeah,
And I agree with you. I don't think it's for better or for worse. It's just here.
it's
And
here.
we have to make a decision, each of us, how we plan to use it that support our life, and then I think we have to broaden it and say, well, how does it support our community too? So
And clearly it can. And I am absolutely astounded at how connected we remained through this pandemic shutdown. And I don't think any of us understood how the technology had evolved to enable us to do that
right,
until it was thrown at us.
right,
And it's pretty stunning.
right.
But we also, I bet you pretty much anybody listening to this thing has experienced Zoom fatigue.
Oh,
And,
that's good. I
being
agree.
being absolutely exhausted at the end of the day,
Right.
having been in 5 or 6 or 8 of these meetings, and and here we are doing another one right now.
Yes, we
Um,
are. But
but
I do
yeah,
think that in a way, it really has kept people connected, and business, how you interact with your family or how you interact out in the commercial world is changing. It will change
yeah,
because we realize that people working from home can actually maybe be more productive. My son said that to me, that uh, that's like one of the fallouts, that people are more productive, or can be more productive. So
yeah.
if you're
I
not going to be productive, you're just not going to be productive.
I have to confess, I'm fairly certain that my attention span has become shorter through
Mm.
all of this, and
Oh,
and
that's interesting.
I'm not sure what to do about it. Um, but I'm aware of it. I can feel it. Things, the sound bites and the quick little glimpses of stuff, and we can just check on anything with a moment's, click of the thumb. And I am worried for myself, and I am therefore worried for others in the community. I'm worried for my grandkids and how this technology is affecting them. And I think that part of our adaptation is that we're going to need to understand this better and understand the ramifications and the implications. And I don't have it by any means figured out.
So we can agree that cities are in constant change. I always think of a city as an organism. It
Mhm.
is,
Yeah,
it's a body. And if our bodies continue to change, even if we don't want them to, um, cities do the same thing. They're
yeah,
made up of living, breathing people, and they evolve just like we evolve. And I think this allows us to talk about the topic of, since we color our hair, we brush our teeth, we do things. Um, we now, what is transformative adaptation? We can't tear a city
yeah,
down and start all over again just
yeah.
because we have COVID or had COVID, and maybe there's another one down the road. We want to talk about, if we're looking at sense of place, how do we evolve over time intentionally? Maybe that's a good way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that is the kind of the crux of the whole matter. And in California, I think we are dealing with this at a grand scale right now because um, I think honestly, what is becoming more and more evident is that the way our cities have changed to a certain extent has been intentional. And I want to be careful about this because we began to implement codes in the 1940s, 1950s that really dramatically directed how land use could support community and where certain things could be built and where they couldn't be built. And there's a great dialogue going on right now about how land use and zoning has been used to segregate
Right.
people, to segregate
Absolutely.
classes, to segregate us from each other, and to divide communities into, zones of acceptability.
Right.
And I don't know how, I think in the planning profession, I'm not sure that was, I could honestly say that was fully intentional. I think that the idea was that we would create transitions of zoning, different intensities, and we would separate the uncomfortable uses like in the industry and things like that from residential uses. But what really happened was we broke down the original kind of organic shape and character of neighborhoods, which were any older neighborhood you go through, and I mean older meaning pre-World War II, you will see a mix of houses and duplexes and apartments and markets that you could walk to.
Right. Commercial.
And pre-World War II, the zoning laws started to just obliterate all of that, and they could do it because we could drive everywhere and we didn't need to live close to those things. But just to illustrate the magnitude of change, this is downtown Los Angeles in circa 1855. This is where the Olvera Street Plaza is, and this was 17 decades ago. So this is downtown Los Angeles 17 decades later. 17 decades seems maybe like a long time, but the last decade for me has gone by really fast. And, this really isn't all that long.
Right.
I don't know exactly how intentional all of this was. But it does dramatically illustrate the magnitude by which change is happening. And
Well, but I would agree
yeah.
with you that zoning and planning have that it's done a lot of, it's created those types of corridors. And I think through COVID, we've found that maybe that's not necessarily good, that we can maybe break that down. And we're hoping that the planners and the zoners are thinking about that.
Yeah, and yes, and so what COVID has done, I mean, there's been a lot of awareness of this for many years, but what COVID has done is kind of magnify the issues,
Absolutely.
the challenges,
Yeah.
and it's really cracked open the protective shell around which we've dealt with a lot of this stuff with kid gloves. Now we're starting to have some really honest conversations about these things that I have not seen in my career. It was very hard to talk about how zoning had been used to racially and class-wise segregate people, and that conversation is absolutely happening right now.
Oh yeah. Well, and I think the other thing that's impacted it is the whole issue of climate change. It's real that it has impacted the way we live, the reality of our limited resources. And along with that, we now know that we need that diversity and inclusion and equity are absolutely have to be part of the equation. And they both, COVID showed that up. And I think, like you say, there are real conversations about it now. There's a real reality around it. And it's going to impact it.
And yes, I totally agree. And climate change isn't it interesting? I mean, climate change has really been in our faces for the last 20 years, and we're all, we're all kind of, we got our fingers in our ears and we're humming really loud so that we don't have to pay too much attention to it, because frankly, I think most of us don't know what to do about it.
Right.
But I think as we start to break it down and we think about intentionality, there are things that every community can do to begin to mitigate the negative impacts that we have in the way we've lived on that climate. And the car is certainly at the center of a lot of that. I love this image. This is downtown Ventura, circa 1930. At the time that this part of our community was developed, the zoning code was 5 pages long, and there was no parking standard. There was no requirement for cars or parking anywhere. People had cars, as we can see clearly, but the zoning code was 5 pages long. Interestingly, this is the part of the city that even today, almost 100 years later, is still the most cherished part of our city. And it's the part that was developed without all the codes and without all the standards and without all the segregation, frankly. But it is the part that most Venturans point to and say, that's my town.
Right.
So just real quickly, and I apologize because some people have probably seen these things 100 times, but this is just a quick overview of what's happened to our communities as we've succumbed to automobiles and zoning. And this is a traditional town. And the thing about the traditional town is that we just built close together naturally. And your comparison to an organism, Mary, is right on, because this is basically a cellular thing. It had a center, and it had a transitioning outer realm and an edge. And you could tell when you were in the country, and you could tell when you were coming to the city, and when you were in the city, and when you were in the downtown, like we just saw at Ventura.
Right.
And then after World War II, all hell broke loose, and we just started to build, and people could live anywhere and work anywhere else because they could get in their car and go there. And so over time, and this happened to Ventura, it happened to Ventura in a more linear fashion as we spread out across Midtown and East Ventura. But you can see this very same kind of structure happening in Ventura over time. And pretty soon you can't recognize any of it. Where was that town? Where was that? So, I think it's important to understand that this is to me, this is the ramification. I want to say this is the ramification of an unintentional change, but zoning codes take on the guise of being very intentional.
Right.
How does that work? What was the intention?
But I think the intentions 20 or 30 years ago are I think after World War II, there was the baby boomers, and it created the need for housing. And I think it was managed. They weren't going to let it not happen. They were just going to manage it. And I think what we saw through COVID was the fact you didn't have to get in your car and work. You could stay at home and work. Now, I think that what people learned, though, was they we're still social beings. So somehow we need to find that balance, maybe each one of us. But then when you broaden it out, how do we get that balance in the community between having your personal space and yet wanting to be social and getting your work done without always getting in your car? So I think that it's there's still a lot of dialogue that needs to happen around that.
And that's the exciting part, I think. That's the fundamental basis of intentional change.
Right.
Having that dialogue. And you're absolutely right. The COVID really did show us that the assumptions we had about our daily life and our daily work patterns and all of that stuff maybe weren't so valid anymore, weren't so necessary. And that's kind of amazing.
Right.
This is a picture of the mall, and we'll talk about this a little bit more shortly. But the thing to see here is how much of this place is dedicated to everybody driving to it, so they could get out of their cars, so they could walk around and enjoy themselves in a social context.
Yes.
And shop and spend money, because ultimately that's what the mall is all about. The intention is to get you to come in and enjoy yourself and spend your money, which is fine, nothing wrong with that. But it's an island in the community, and it's in trouble because one of the things that COVID has done, of course, was magnify what was already starting to happen in the retail markets, and that is that we didn't need to go to a store to get anything anymore. We could sit in our comfy chair and order it from home, which is,
So why don't we talk about the mall? one of the things I've read a couple articles about is about the conversion of malls. So this is like, to me, the prime example of transformative adaptation is the idea that there's this huge amount of land in the middle or someplace in town, and a lot of those are, people realize they don't have to go to the mall. The mall is a social experience. And so I came across an article, and I'm going to put it in the chat. It's called Ghost Town: Converting Vacant Commercial Buildings into Housing. And I think the state of I think it's New Jersey, has said before you can build another structure, you have to look at all the vacant structures. I mean, I think even the US Census has numbers on vacant structures within each state. And I don't know where I was going with that, but I found it interesting that we still have structures. So yes, we have to house the homeless, but isn't there a way we can use malls to support community life and not tear them down just because they're not serving any purpose? Matter of fact, I heard one statistic a long time ago that 33% or 40% of landfill is concrete. Now, maybe that's, or construction waste, I guess is whether it's deconstructing or constructing. It's the idea that we should figure out how to enrich what we already have and make it serviceable. Because you're right, the mall is dying, and it's not the only one that's doing it.
Yeah. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity for reusing buildings. This is probably more true in older cities where there's older industrial areas, and we've seen them, the conversion of older industrial buildings to lofts and residential places that could be quite amazing. And in downtown Los Angeles, we've been seeing some of this as well. And I suppose that it's true that the buildings at the mall could be over time converted. I'm not sure what that looks like, but I think it's worth asking the question. To me, the bigger question though is that there's the assumption that Ventura is kind of built out and there's nowhere to build unless we go out into the farmland. And I think the mall is a good example, and I've got a few other examples that absolutely is not the case. And we're seeing, if I had talked about reusing the mall 5 years ago, well, and I did actually, the response would be pretty flat. Like, the assumption is it's going to stay there and it's doing just fine. And what are you talking about? Today, if we talk about it, it's a very different response. Like, oh yeah. And the point being, the mall may stay as it is for another decade. I don't really know. I don't have a crystal ball, but clearly the market is changing and the role of this facility is changing. So as a community, we should be asking the question, what next? What would we like to see happen here?
Which is intentional. What would
Which
we
is
like
intentional,
to see happen?
exactly. And that's where the fun starts, honestly, because as we know, there's a lot of large anchors here that have been sort of the reliant commercial cores of this thing, and they're all struggling. And I think the food court's doing okay, and Trader Joe's seems to be doing fine, and frankly, Target seems to be finding its way through all of this. But Sears is gone. Somebody told me Penny's wasn't open. I'm not sure about that. I don't want to
No,
spread.
Penny's is open, but
Okay.
I'm sure this is not the only place where Penny's discovered that through COVID. The mall was closed.
Yeah.
They lost revenue a lot. I don't know.
Sure. And post-COVID, maybe, the mall may reopen and, it may not be dead at all, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't think about how to bolster it, retool some of the land. There's certainly huge amount of surface parking that could all become part of community. There's no reason why it needs to stay that way just because, 2 weeks out of the year it gets really busy during Christmas. um, let's look at how we want to see it retool, and that's really about asking the questions. What could we do with this land if we had a choice and we could help rethink it? How would we use the transit systems that connect this to our community? How would we make this thing more pedestrian oriented, more pedestrian friendly, and more integrated into our community instead of this island uh, that's kind of surrounded by car stuff.
Right, right,
So so one of the things I've done that I've had a lot of fun with is taking a look at Bauban, Germany, which is the mall is about 100 acres and Vauban is about 100 acres. And Vauban was a military base, actually a very old military base, I think first established in the 1700s in Germany. But in the 1970s, some squatters started to take over some of the old buildings, and it gradually became a place for sustainability experimentation and building types that were net zero energy and solar and community gardens and all kinds of things have been happening there. And over the last 4 decades, there's been a lot of very innovative development in terms of housing and town center, and it's linked to the city of Freiburg by transit. And there's a lot of very experimental and exploratory architecture. There's a lot of green roofs and community garden space, and this community is basically 75 to 80% car free. That you don't need to own a car to live in Vauban. You can get around just fine using bike and transit. There are bike paths integrated into the planning of the place, and it's very family oriented. And it's a model of sustainability that people come from all over the world to visit and study and understand. And Vauban fits on the Pacific View Mall. And I'm not proposing that we just, go in and nuke the mall and build Vauban, but I do find the utilization of land and the differences illustrated there to be quite compelling. And
right.
even if we were just to do some of this, in the parking areas and to retool and to create a place that actually, took advantage of the transit connections and the idea that there might be an actual town center there.
Right.
These are the kinds of transformative things that I think we should be talking about as we are, looking at retooling our general plan. These are big questions for sure.
So now that you mentioned the general plan, for those
Mhm.
of you on this podcast, Nick is a member of the oversight committee for the update of Ventura's general plan. And one of the questions I wanted to ask him is, given what the last year and a half has brought to this community by COVID, what 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 do you think we might learn? What have we learned that could impact the update to the better? I mean, I really think it's the better. The general plan tells us what Ventura is going to be like, sort of like our baseline. And I'm curious to know what your thoughts are about what are the different possibilities that could happen with the general plan,
Mhm.
because we have gone through COVID.
Mhm. And I think COVID is the whole COVID situation is great because it's magnified some of the issues that we were already, grappling with. And it's, again, it's that sort of shift in thinking that happens that we couldn't have made happen. I'll share one last slide here that I think illustrates this really well.
Yeah,
And
we're about there on time.
if I had proposed shutting down Main Street 2 years ago and letting the restaurants take over the street and letting people just walk up and down, I probably would have been tarred and feathered and run out of town.
Run out of
Um,
town finally.
how dare you? This is outrageous. Um, so COVID comes along, and suddenly we have to adapt. Transformative adaptation. And this is entirely organic. This wasn't some, genius architect or planner coming up with a grand vision of how things should be. Although this certainly there were visions of this, over the last century in different forms. This was the community responding to a crisis with adaptation. And it's not perfect. That some of the merchants have been challenged by the restrictions of COVID, because what they had to do was shut the sidewalk down so that the restaurant would connect directly to its outside dining area.
Right.
Few people realize probably, but in 1994, when we first drafted the first version of the Downtown Specific Plan, there was an intention to have dining areas where the diagonal parking is. And if you walk down that street, you will see that the diagonal parking is actually poured in concrete. And the intention was that the sidewalk could ebb and flow and be wider and fill out into that area so that restaurants could do exactly what you see in this picture.
Right.
However, the Public Works Department was not comfortable with the idea that there might not be curbs and gutters, and they required the curbs and gutters to be left intact. And what that meant was that there was a step between the sidewalk and the concrete area, which was sloped to drain to the gutter, and it made it very awkward and uncomfortable to put tables and chairs. So it never happened. It was an idea, it was intentional in the plan, and it wasn't allowed to happen the way it was intended. So COVID comes along, suddenly we have to adapt. And so what do the restaurants do? They built decks bridging the gutter and the curb in the gutter so that they could smoothly flow out from the restaurant space to the dining area.
Yeah.
And it's been fabulous. And I don't know if it's going to stay this way, but I'm certainly hearing a lot of people wishing that it would. People that I've had coming visit us, and that have never been to Ventura, come here and go, wow, this is amazing. Has it always been like this? That's the first question. Is this because they've never seen this before? And I would imagine this is happening in other communities all across California. It would be really cool to kind of do a study about that. But we've all been talking about parklets for years.
Right.
Never could get a permit to do a parklet. Oh, you can't take away parking. No, you can't. No, parking is sacred. No, it's
I
not.
think the idea is that what was that? It kind of has more of a European feel, which means where you're living, you're eating outside. I mean, it really has more, reminds me a little bit of Montreal. When you look at it, you go, oh yeah, I like this sort of thing.
And all that means, when we say it has a European feeling, all we're saying is, oh yeah, that's like a place that happened before the car dominated our lives.
Right.
That's what that's really about.
That's
'Cause
true.
Europe,
You're right.
Europe happened that way.
Right.
And the car was fitted into the community instead of the community fitting around the car.
Right.
So I think this is an amazing thing. It's really quite wonderful that we were able to see that happen.
Right.
And it's a great kind of precursor to this whole conversation of, intentional change and COVID change and all of that. So, yeah.
I want to thank you very much, Nick, for this conversation and for your enthusiasm. I really think that things will happen. They won't happen tomorrow, but and we, the American Institute of Ventura County, would like to keep this conversation going. So in the fall, I'm going to knock on Denise's door again, and
Cool.
we might. I always come up with different topics, so we'll come up. But I really want to keep this conversation going because it's really relevant, and I think it's relevant to everybody in Ventura County. And Denise, do we have any questions, or are we such great talkers that nobody has a question for us?
That's me. I'm a great talker.
Yeah, you absolutely, no, you absolutely have questions. And so Jeffrey Lambert, who you both know very well, who was on our panel discussion last month, has a question for both of you. And what are one or two of the most obvious and exciting transformations that Ventura can aim towards that can inform healthy economic development in the future? So I'll let you decide who's going to go first.
So can you restate the question?
Of course. So Jeff's asking,
Yeah.
what are one or two of the most obvious and exciting transformations that you think Ventura can aim towards that would then inform healthy economic development? So
Yeah, great. That's great. So, we're in this chicken and egg situation where we need to grow. And wherever we try to grow within the community, the people in that immediate area tend to react with a lot of fear about that change. How is this going to affect me? And traffic is so terrible. And how do we do this? And I think that as we try to accommodate more growth, we need to begin, and this is a hard conversation, but I think we're ready for it. We need to begin really seriously considering how we can begin to wean development off of cars. It's not to say that cars shouldn't be there, but they should not dominate. The parking ordinances that we have in this city are, the first thing I have to do anytime I start a new project is try to figure out how to accommodate all the cars. And typically the requirement is essentially for about 2 cars per dwelling, because everybody has to have 2 cars. Even when you're building affordable housing, and you are building housing for people who are going to have a hard time affording the housing, but we're expecting them to have to afford a car and get into it and go wherever they need to go. So that's not, you can't just say, okay, we're not going to have cars. We'll just get rid of the parking ordinance. Actually, you could say that. But what we need to do is be planning our community around where some of the development will go that will be car free or car liberated. In my mind, that's along our main corridors where bus lines are already running. The buses, we complain about the bus system because it doesn't run very often, and it's hard to know what the schedule is, but that's because there's not a lot of ridership. And if we could design in the physical form of bus ridership with the physical form of the new development strategy, we can begin to bridge the gap between those things. And then when we build new development, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're adding all kinds of more cars to the streets. I think another thing that we really seriously should be looking at is creating some dedicated, physically separated bike lanes along major corridors. And that's also a big, leap, but we see it in all kinds of communities where it's been successful. And why haven't we taken it seriously? And the main answer is because we continue to make it so easy and actually required to be car dependent. We just continue to do that.
So I have 2 things. And one is, I have this dream, kind of like to start breaking down suburbs. And one is to turn single family houses into duplexes, or allow suburbs to have a mom and pop mart, like right down the street, that we start integrating other things into the suburbs. Like you have a 2-family house. If you can figure out a way to cut that house in half and get somebody else to live there, then you're starting to create the kind of density that will support bus service.
Yes.
It'll start supporting commercial uses that are important, like mom and pop stores, or tool sharing or lawnmower sharing, those kinds of things. The other thing that I brought up earlier is, and I really believe that the single family house, that's doable. That can happen. We're already doing ADUs, accessory dwelling units, but I really think we still have to attack the large McMansions kind of thing.
Yeah.
The other thing I'd like to see, and I brought it up earlier, is do an inventory of all the vacant commercial property and figure out how you use that to support small business. Because if you support small business and create and have them create a presence and have a presence, the people will come. And those are like big pie in the sky kind of things. But unless we start talking about them and putting them out there and then starting to back up to today, they won't happen. But you have to say, okay, they're out there. How do we step backwards? What are the little steps we need? What's the first step we need to get there? So I think that what Nick talked about, there's always some creative way to make that happen. And we can enrich the community rather than deplete the community. And that's what Ventura wants. They want this richness, don't we all, kind of thing.
I agree completely with that, Mary. I think that the development that we're all afraid of, which, by the way, is driven by the current zoning code substantially.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I understand why that scares people. I understand that. It is very difficult in the current circumstance to go in and retool those codes and retool that plan. But we're in the process of doing it. We're having the conversations. I think that we're seeing the level of housing crisis in the state of California is such that the state is starting to say, you know, you can no longer use these zoning laws to thwart the production of housing. So if we're not careful, they're
already mandating it. It's
I know, and the challenge is we don't want them to mandate it such that you can put this stuff wherever you want it. We want to be thoughtful about it.
right.
So we have to get out ahead of the curve and you know, be intentional about what kind of a community we want to make. And then and honestly, we've been doing this for a long time. The West Side community started doing it 20 years ago. They're still struggling with some of the challenges because, you know, the community is not a homogenous thing. There's a lot of different opinions. We started doing it with the downtown, and we are seeing now the results. And it's scaring a lot of people because you're seeing about 20 years of pent up energy now coming. But, you know, it's also at the heart of our community. We're going to see places for people to live where they have never lived before. And we're going to see community in a form that we have never seen before in Ventura. And I think it's cool. I think it's going to be really exciting. And the museum, by the way, is going to be in the heart of it.
Yeah, that's right. We are going to be in the heart of it. I have one quick question because we're coming up on 7:30 and I want to be able to talk a little bit about, and maybe this is something that's being explored in the general plan, but we have a very small handful of community gardens in the city of Ventura. We have vacant lots surrounded by chain link fence that have been fallow for years, if not decades. And I think that something that I think that would really be transformational would be to be able to work with private property owners and the city to come up with a kind of a agreement to allow community members to come together to improve the land. Gardens are temporary, you know, they don't necessarily change the structure. They create good earth over time. It doesn't prevent a future development. But what is a stumbling block to getting more community gardens? Because I look at the East End as this would benefit tremendously because those gardens bring the community together. It becomes a gathering space. So I'm just curious, in the general plan update, is there anything that calls that out?
To my knowledge, no, there isn't.
But that seems like an obvious, I mean, other cities, particularly like Detroit, have done that.
Philadelphia has a great program in Philadelphia.
I think it's like, if that's what the community wants, it can happen. I don't think it's rocket science. It's just that, and also it produces food, you know, like children learn where the food comes from. I mean, it's really, an opportunity that should be considered. I agree with you.
Yeah,
I-
it's,
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the mechanism is to do that. I know we have some community gardens. The the challenge I would think is that, you know, you get all the issues, you know, liability,
mhm,
who's oversight, is it happening under it? But I could see how it could be, um, in new developments of certain types, if, you know, there could be part of the general plan could be that if a developer includes a community garden in their project, then they will get a density bonus of X, or they will get this
mhm.
kind of incentive or that kind of incentive. There's ways for us to engineer the kind of community we want through creative policymaking.
Yeah,
Right.
You know, I think we have, again, it's an intention, and that's a great idea.
yeah. I think it's something, there are models out there. Seattle has the P-Patch program where there's a nonprofit that's the umbrella, but it really empowers neighbors to come together. And
Yeah,
some of those lots are the size of a single family, maybe a, you know, single family residential property, and others are more expansive.
it
But
doesn't take much. Yeah,
yeah, but they're really designed to tailor the immediate neighborhood and
yeah.
to provide that resource. Well, we
Well,
could go ahead, Nick.
well, I want to tell you, the housing authority of the city of San Buenaventura is rebuilding the Westview project, which was a 1950s public housing project. That project incorporates several community gardens for the residents to use. Their project at the corner of Oak and Thompson has a corner lot that was intended for additional development. They did not have the funding to do that, so right now there is a community garden at that corner, and the residents there use it. They love it, and it's working very well. So the idea absolutely makes a lot of sense. It's a great way to provide relief in an urban context, where kids and residents can get their hands in the soil and enjoy, you know, their own homegrown food at the table. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Well, that it's
Thank you.
fantastic. I'm so happy that we had this opportunity to have this conversation. It's 7:33, so this is my time to thank both you, Nick, and Mary for bringing this conversation to the museum and to our audience. Look forward to Mary calling me up this fall and presenting some new ideas. We'll be happy to present future conversations.
yeah.
If people want to get involved in the update to the general plan, Nick, is there a way in which for them to do that?
Oh, absolutely. So the meetings are all happening on, yay, Zoom. They are virtual meetings, but that's been really cool because I think in the last meeting there were 89 people on this thing. And you know, there are committee members, and you can see a little name, a little tag that says member, and then there's all kinds of other people who are not on the committee, but the chat is running the entire time. People are typing in questions, and the team leading the general plan is quite good. And frankly, our city planning staff is good. They're doing a good job. They're taking good notes. They're asking good questions, and anybody can join those meetings and add their questions into the chat. The chat is recorded as a part of the Zoom video, so these meetings are all being recorded. So any input that you have when you attend is part of the record. It's pretty awesome. So participating is actually about as easy as it's ever been in the history of my experience with these processes.
That's great. So they can just go to the city's website, go ahead and search for the general plan update,
Yep.
and they'll have a link there. Wonderful.
Definitely.
That's great to know. And I'm going to take a moment to just thank our audience for being here tonight. And there will be a recording of tonight's discussion that will be posted on the museum's YouTube channel, and we'll be promoting that and sending that out. So if you know people who missed tonight's program, it will be available. I want to just let everybody know that the museum will continue to offer virtual programming, but we are thrilled to be inviting the public back in our doors on July 1st, both in Ventura, downtown Ventura campus, and the Santa Paula Agriculture Museum. So if you want to get your hands dirty, come out to Santa Paula, because we've got gardens for you to dig in and help us grow our gardens. But I just want to say again, thank you to both of you, and look forward to working with you in the future. And thanks to everybody who tuned in tonight. So
Yeah, my pleasure. And let's invite Jeff Lambert to these things from now on. He's
I
got a
know.
lot of great ideas.
got lots of comments. Yes.
It would make it easier, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you very much.